Nate Phelps.
Thank you all very much for being here, and special thanks to the folks who put this together. The effort was profound and appreciated. Had the opportunity to meet a lot of new friends here, which I appreciate very much. Community is a significant part of our campaign at the Center for Inquiry in Calgary, where I head up. And so I appreciate anytime I see that kind of effort going on in other parts of the world. So, having said that, we'll get on with it. How many of you here have heard of the Holy Bible? Particularly the King James Version. That's your fault. So there are 66 books in the Bible. Starts with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Psalm, Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the actual ones, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, and the Revelation. When I was 8 years old, my father required that all the children memorize the books of the Bible because he got tired of waiting while the kids were searching through the Bible to find the passages he was preaching from. And so once that had been nailed down, he would, if someone took too long at finding the passage, he would pause in his preaching and he would cast a gimlet eye on the offending child and demand that someone smack that kid. It kind of gives you an overview of what it was like in Westboro Baptist Church. So back in 1991, the church, at that time there were approximately about 50 members, best I can tell. It was primarily my father, 9 of my siblings, and then their offspring, as well as one family or 4 that weren't related to the family. Well, at that time there wasn't, just my family as far as I know. They started a campaign at a park in Picket, Kansas, where they discovered that gays were gathering for whatever reason. And so they showed up on the corner of 10th and Gage, and they cobbled together some handmade signs. The most interesting one being a sign that said, "God hates fags." And so the community, while it wasn't necessarily opposed to the message, they were opposed to the style that my father used, were familiar with the style that my father used because he had been at odds with the community for decades prior to that for any number of reasons. So the response of the community was to act in opposition to what my family was trying to do. And that, of course, just caused them to feel that much worse. So started out as a kind of a local campaign. And then Matthew Shepard, the young gay man from Laramie, Wyoming, was tortured and killed. At that time, we understood it was because of he was gay, and so it got international attention. And my family decided they would go there and protest at his funeral. And it was to be a seminal moment for them because they got so much attention at that point that when the war started in Iraq and the activity started in Afghanistan, we started seeing American soldiers coming home dead, and we decided this would be the perfect opportunity to get ourselves in front of as many people as possible. So what started out as basically a local community harassment campaign turned into national test case for free speech. They went from belittling their neighbors to impinging on the international psyche with a biblical cudgel. Nothing was sacred to them. No one was immune. Victims large and small were their targets, and natural and man-made disasters were their venues. There were killer tornadoes in the aftermath that they attended. There were school shootings, mall shootings, business shootings, hurricanes, death of the famous and not so famous, even the Oscar ceremonies. And yes, I do include that in man-made disasters. So wherever there was a national wound, you would find the Subtitled Westboro Baptist Church there with their signs. Signs basically declaring that God hates everything and everyone in America, throughout the world, primarily because as a people, we dared to insist that the mandated equality be met for all citizens. That's what they were opposed to. Unless the good people of England feel like they were left out in all of this, there's this on their website, God Hates the World, in reference to the United Kingdom. When WBC announced plans to conduct a peaceful picket outside the fag propaganda play, the Laramie Project, at Basingstoke. Did I say that right? Basingstoke. The fags and their neighbors began to howl like the dogs they are. In response, Home Secretary Jackie Smith issued a ban to keep WBC out of the country. Good for you. You British bastards will not have Jesus Christ to rule over you. I think you can issue bans and pass laws to remove God's word from the landscape. You do greatly err not knowing the power of God, and you do that against your own interests. It's a great kindness to have God's prophets in your land. But you ungrateful brutes despise knowledge. Interesting comment for this group. It's too late for the UK. God hates you. God's wrath and destruction is all that's left for you, thanks to Secretary Smith. And they sign off with toodles. Yes, I think that's something. Toodles. Prime Minister from 1997 to 2007 was Tony Blair, who never saw a fag-enabling cause he did not fully support and convince his queen to fully support. That is undoubtedly how the gay harassment law of 2007 was passed, which will get you 7 years in prison for preaching to or about the fags. Anyway, it goes on. So you haven't been forgotten in all this. A few years back, Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple Computer, passed away. They announced that they were going to picket his memorial service because he had an international platform and he didn't use it to further God's cause in the world. The irony was lost on them that they made that announcement primarily with their iPhones. And then the Ku Klux Klan, there's a website, one of their websites, where they put a disclaimer on the front page that they were not involved with and had nothing to do with and did not approve of the activities of the Westboro Baptist Church. You gotta admit that's a feather in their hat. So when they started doing this in 1991 and people were asking me what I thought about it, my response was this was inevitable. This was everything that I was seeing, the mannerisms, the words, the ideas were something that I had been raised with from infancy. It wasn't new to me. My father's message had been passed down to us literally from the first Sunday that we came home from the hospital. We were sitting in the pews. We had verses written on the chalkboard in the family room that we had to memorize, and there were books and records all over the house that we were exposed to. I recall one book where they had a full-page spread, one of the children's books, and it had this huge panoramic view of the world soaked in water, rocks outcropping where people were clinging desperately with their clothes half off. And there's a mother with her infant child clinging to the side of the raft or the ark, and she's raising her little child up in the air to try to save it. and Noah standing with his flowing robes, his flowing beard on the ark, ignoring the tragedy before him. So this was the God that we understood to be in our youth. And then there was a sign that sat in the vestibule of our church for most of the time I was growing up there. I don't know what it was originally intended for. There was a corner of it broken off. It had a verse painted on it from the book of Hebrews that said, "It is appointed unto men once to die, and after this, the judgment." So this message of an angry, vengeful, judgmental God was what we were hearing constantly growing up there. One of my first cogent memories was sitting in the pew, and my father was going on one of his sermons about hell, and the worm that eats on you never dies, and the final hell of punishment. And I decided I was going to try to get my mind around this idea of eternity. So while he went on, this is something I did often when I was growing up. I kind of went off in my own little world and considered things that he was talking about. And so I'm trying to get my mind around this idea of eternity, and with an 8-year-old's mind. And so you try to imagine forever as best you can, and then you try to imagine that just being a drop, or maybe the dew on the side of a bucket, and there's forever again, and there's just a little bit more. Pretty soon the concept became so frightening that I was in tears. And I remember thinking at the time, or actually after the fact, this was really the first time I remember the impact of my father's message starting to have affect me. So, anyway, my father is a self-avowed primitive Baptist, is what he calls himself. He adheres to the teachings of John Calvin, the tulip doctrines, and woven throughout these doctrines and basically informing all of them is, I think that it would take Calvinism to its logical conclusion that madness is always at the end of that road. One of my earliest doubts about that belief system arose from this question that my young mind formed, that if, in fact, the Adamic race is cursed with this immorality and corruption, then why is it that we turn to the writings of these same immoral men to find our salvation? Of course, my father would say that when they were writing this stuff, they were inspired by God. To which I would reply, using the words of Louis Theroux, well, it would, wouldn't it? So, from behind the pulpit every Sunday, my father was raging against every idea, every belief system that was out there, every political system that was out there. He would find the more popular preachers of the time and would rage against them. He would build these straw men up, and he would destroy them. And he was systematic about it. He was very effective. So we got to the point where any thoughts that were contrary to the thoughts that came out of the Westboro Baptist Church, specifically out of my father's head, any thoughts that we had, we would look at something we saw in the world and we would think, well, maybe it's this. And immediately your mind goes to this idea that because you're thinking contrary to what you've been taught, that Satan is at work in your heart. So you literally learn to stop trusting that instinctive nature that we have to recognize right and wrong, good and bad. Any violation of Fred's rules puts you at risk of being ostracized, harassed, excommunicated, and exposed you to violence. I had several of my nieces who left about a year and a half ago. It was quite a story in the U.S. because Megan was considered to be the next in the line. She was Shirley's daughter, and Shirley was the visible spokesperson for the church, and she had been at Shirley's right side for 4 or 5 years. she decided to leave. Actually, a Jewish community invited them up to Montreal, and they were up there, and we had a big story about them. And Megan is talking about her experience leaving in that story. And this is what she had to say. It kind of speaks to these issues that I mentioned a minute ago. She said, over time, we started to see things that made us think, wait a second, there's something wrong here. This doesn't fit together. I need to pause here and tell you that for all of us in the ex-Christian community, this is what we call the aha moment. And at some point, sooner or later, that moves on to the what the hell were we thinking moment. And then you've got to be freaking kidding me moment. Not necessarily in that order. So this was her aha moment, and I think that's an important part of the process of moving away from this kind of fundamentalist, crazy thinking that so many are raised with. You have to have the aha moment before you can finally start to let go. But she goes on to say, questioning proved difficult due to the strict interpretation of scriptures by Mr. Phelps, or they refer to him as Gramps. It was always very much all or nothing. The way the church presents it is there's the Westboro Baptist Church and the rest of the world. The rest of the world is evil. Westboro Baptist Church is the only place in the world in our generation that is right. That led to a decision to leave the square 2-block section of Picket. She said hurting my mom was the worst thing of all. Their family made it clear if they left, it would be a clean break. They believe they cannot care about anything but what God thinks. And they're so sure about what God thinks that there can be no other option. We were both terrified after leaving. I was afraid we were going to hell. Many times when we were driving, I thought God was going to kill us. So we talk about violence. Often when we talk about violence, we think in terms of physical violence. This was the real violence, folks. These ideas that she will carry in her mind for years to come. So struggle with it. But there's another type of violence that we grew up with. It was a fact of life in our home when I was a child. As I reached the age of awareness, my father decided that he was going to go to law school and get a law degree. There were 10 of us at the time, I think. And so he ended up addicted to prescription amphetamines and then barbiturates to get himself to sleep at night after taking too many of the uppers. And so his temper, which was already fairly volatile, was just that much worse. So we lived in this environment where you never knew when he was going to explode. Instead of using the doors to go outside after our mom woke us and dressed us, she would open a window and have us crawl out the window just so there was no risk of too much noise and bringing down the wrath of my father. But eventually he graduated from law school, started his practice, but within a couple of years he was suspended for ethical violations, had a 2-year suspension. So suddenly there's no income. So my father came up with the idea that he was going to send the children out to sell candy for Jesus. And so we started selling candy, and the story we told folks was that we were selling it to buy a new piano. And then pretty soon we're going to also buy a new organ. And then after a couple of years, people were wondering why we hadn't bought the instruments yet. So that forced us out of the Picket community into other communities surrounding us. And somewhere in that process, we discovered that people were a lot looser with their money when they'd had a few drinks. So we would find ourselves on a Friday and a Saturday night at the right hour, at the happy hour, selling chocolates for Jesus in the bars with the strippers performing just a few feet away. And now, at least for me, I'm not complaining about the scenery so much as the hypocrisy that was apparent even to a teenager at that point. That we were supposed to be the chosen ones. We, above all else, were supposed to have our halos on straight and be a sign for the rest of the world of what it's like to be holy. And we're selling candy from the strippers. So That was one of the things that happened after his suspension. Another thing that happened on the first anniversary of his suspension, I came home from school and my mom was sitting in the vestibule of the church, and she had a stocking cap on her head and had been crying, and my brother Mark was there trying to comfort her. And she took the stocking cap off, and her hair had all been cut off. And it was a butcher job. There were spots where you could see the scalp and spots where it was an inch or two long. And she announced to us that he had cut her hair off because she was not being in subjection to him. So while I'm sitting there looking at that and thinking, okay, yeah, there is definitely an element of violence here. But the more important message to me was the fact that my father had spent all those years talking to us about this passage in 1 Corinthians where it talks about how women are to show their subjection by keeping their hair long and covered while they're in the church. My father had decided that the word for long actually was uncut. So the fact that he had cut her hair off was a very clear message to me, at least, that he had control over her very salvation. Women were second-class citizens in our church and in our family, and there was no compromise on that. My father was adamant about it. The Bible was very clear on that subject. The essence of the argument is that Eve had been deceived by a talking snake. We had a panel discussion earlier today, and I was talking about this. I don't understand exactly what it is, but there is this willingness that we exhibit to give a pass. If I were to walk in here today and say I had a conversation with a snake before coming in here tonight, I have no doubt that you folks would be seeking medical attention for me. But we don't do that because it's such a common idea, and we tend to show respect for it, where respect is not due. When I wrote that line, honestly, folks, I was kind of trying to put a little levity into it because it's a rather dark story, and it just doesn't work. So I figured, well, I'd talk about that. I remember I was in the Chicago O'Hare Airport back in September, flying back from a convention, and I'm sitting at a pub having a beer and watching a football game. It was the Atlanta Falcons, and there was this running back, and he had just completed a really good run, and he was black. And I say that, you'll understand why in a minute. So all of a sudden, over my left shoulder, someone starts yelling, and he's all excited, and he's going on and on. I look around and realize that he's actually talking to me, and that was frightening. But so he's all excited about what this guy just did. He goes, "You know why that happened, don't you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, because he's really good at what he does." And he said, "No, it happened because of Nimrod." And I kind of did a double take. And he said, "Yeah, see, in the Bible, God talks about Nimrod being a great warrior nation, and then they were cast down and they became enslaved. And they will rise up once more before they're finally destroyed." And what he had said in that moment was basically that blacks were, for whatever reason, they're evil in God's eyes, and that they were great, and then they were enslaved, because remember we had black slaves. And then they rose back up, so now they're really the running backs and sports people, but eventually they'll be destroyed. And this man says this in public with no fear that someone's going to take him and lock him up. We give him a pass. I just find that remarkable at times. Anyway, so on to the whole women are second-class citizens. Paul, of course, bolsters that idea in the New Testament. He talks about wives being in subjection to their husbands. So my father extrapolated from that he had the right, even the duty, to bring her back into subjection if she strayed too far. The problem was that when my father turned his instructive fist on my mother, there was an instinctive understanding inside of me that this was not right. Here's a man who's 6'3", 250 pounds, and my mom is half his size. But there's nothing we can do about it because this is God giving the authority to him. As this one obviously did him with his mother, he also took the passages in Proverbs to heart that you spare the rod, you spoil the child. So he decided fairly early on in our lives that he was going to find a larger rod so that we would be even less spoiled. So he brought in a Maddock handle, which is about a 4.5 foot piece of wood with the business end is about 15 inches in circumference. And he would swing that when he was beating a child with, like he was swinging a baseball bat. And generally, those beatings would last an hour or so. It would start out with some, 8 to 10 strokes. And the skin is so damaged from that blunt force trauma. And then he's going to be yelling at us for a while, and then eventually he gets back to a few more swings with the Maddock handle. And the effect of that is that the skin is already so swollen and tender that it splits. And so kids would walk away from these beatings with the back of their legs torn open and this kind of clear, bloody fluid leaking from it. And if he didn't have a Maddock available, he was more than willing to use his fists and his hands and his feet, and he would even at times grab the children by the hands and pull them towards him and drive his knee into their stomach. All these he found were very effective at restoring order in that situation. And again, the thing that I came to understand was that the physical healed. It generally does. But it was the things that he was saying that stayed with you, become kind of hardwired into your mind. So all these things are going on as I'm growing up there. And as I got older, I started doubting more and more what he was telling us. I didn't really have a context. I certainly didn't have the sense of self to own that idea, but the questions were there. And so I would doubt it more, and then I would defy him more. And he did not defy my father, so the violence was, of course, heaped on me more than others. Where he saw brute defiant beasts, like he spoke of in the passage from the internet, I saw humans who were basically good, trying to do right, and struggling with life. I recall when I was in my early teens that I had kind of developed this infatuation for Elton John's music and carried around this cassette player with me where I went and would play it. And so I would be out selling candy and listening to Elton John. And I remember going through this thought process in my mind that here's a man who brings so much good to the world, just in the music. Forget everything else. His music positively impacts thousands, if not millions of people. And none of that matters because of who he decides he's going to love. And that didn't make sense to me. So even that stage in my life, that whole question of deciding the fate of someone based on one particular attribute or one particular aspect of that person in their lives didn't make sense to me. When my father would ridicule and abuse strangers, I would blush. I would be embarrassed. And he hated that in me. He saw it as a weakness. And I, in turn, saw it as a weakness and felt a lot of guilt and shame over it. So I want to shift gears here for just a minute because I think it's important to make this point. The vast majority of people who church, I simply disagree. One of the other things that my father taught us is that God doesn't change. As a Christian, if you're going to be sincere about it and honest about it, the belief is that a single truth was delivered once and for all back, I don't know, I guess when Jesus was around. That's what they believe. Of course, we know that's nonsense, but if they hold to that belief, then, as my they look around the world and they see the religion and the once and for all truth changing. Because that's really what happens, folks. Society's changed, society's evolved, and religion changes with them. They really don't have much choice. They often come kicking and screaming, but they ultimately change if they're to survive. My father saw that change as a degradation of the truth, and he saw the Westboro Baptist Church's adherence, strict adherence, and unwillingness to go with those changes as evidence stronger and stronger as time went on that they were the only proper church because they weren't changing. So then something happened in our family environment. My older brother Mark was dating a gal who was attending the church. She was doing all the proper things so she could eventually marry her. And she came into church one evening and she happened on my father bleeding my older sister and wondered out loud why we were all standing around in the auditorium of the church wringing our hands, and she wondered why someone wasn't doing something about it. So Mark took her outside and scolded her for that, and she made it clear to him, I'm not going to stay here. I'm not going to raise a family in this kind of environment. So she forced Mark to make a choice, and for that gained the title of Jezebelian, dark-eyed, switch-hitting whore from my father. But the effect was that Mark left, and this was the first time in my life that I had even entertained the idea that somehow I could remove myself from this environment. So I also learned that I didn't have a choice but to stay until I was 18 because he had legal authority over us. So I bided my time. I was 16 at the time that Mark left. So over the next couple of years, I worked out a plan, ended up buying an old car, hiding it from the family, slowly packed my meager belongings and hid them in the garage. And then on the night of my 18th birthday, after the family had gone to sleep, it was about 10:30 at night, I went out and got the car and brought it around and backed it into the driveway and loaded it up. And then I went back into the house and stood at the bottom of the stairs. My father's room is right at the top of the stairs, and over to the left is a row of 3 refrigerators and a freezer, and right above it is a clock. And I watched that clock slowly climb towards midnight. And when it hit midnight, I turned around and walked out and left my family of origin on the night of my 18th birthday. So when I left there were folks who knew about the environment we grew up in and said that it was a miracle that I was normal. I didn't necessarily agree with that. I thought it was the fact that I'd gotten away and the physical was gone, that there wouldn't be any more issues to deal with. And thought it was normal that from time to time I would disappear into a silent rage and I wouldn't let anybody talk to me for 2 or 3 hours at a time. I just figured that's who I was and that was normal. So I moved to Southern California in 1981 and I met Tammy and we started dating, and she had a 3-year-old daughter at the time, and so I kind of became a father to Becky. But since she had been married before, I struggled with this theological issue that was still haunting me, that if I married her, that I would make her an adulterer. So that was a challenge for several years for me. And on top of that was this obsessiveness that I had about understanding the idea of love. It was a concept that I couldn't get my mind around because of the environment that we had grown up in. And I remember one day, Tammy came to me and she gave me a 3x5 card where she had written on it something from a book that she had read. And she had written, love is not a feeling by which we are overwhelmed, but rather it's a committed, thoughtful decision. So I said, I can do that. So I asked her to marry me, pushed back the anxieties. We got married, and then within a month, she announced that she was pregnant. And that brought up a whole new issue for me, because we had been raised to understand that children were a gift from God, and that if you abandon God, He's not going to provide you with that gift. So I spent the next 7 months confident that this was going to end tragically. So when my son Tyler was born in June of 1987, it was probably the closest thing to a miracle that I had ever experienced in my life up to that point. And then Tammy had twins 18 months later, and I'm suddenly questioning the whole concept of miracles again. The world shifted at that point, folks. Counseling. I found a counselor who had a theology degree. Spent a year with him. Decided that I was going to join a local church because I thought that was best for the kids as part of that sense of inclusiveness. So I started going to church, listening to the message of the kinder, gentler Christian God, mainstream Christianity, and became actually quite an outspoken apologist for Christianity. Even got myself published in Playboy magazine. I only read it for the art. As the years passed, I'm fighting this battle where I'm acting like I believe this stuff, and then at night I have these sleepless, anxious hours where I'm having these confrontations with my Father in my mind. And there's no answers coming. So I end up more in depression, go back to counseling, I end up being diagnosed with PTSD. End up in a psychiatric hospital for 2 weeks. Come out of that thinking the best thing to do is just try to avoid the subject. So I go back to church and Bible study. And then over the next 10 years, the doubts were building up in me, and events started occurring that started challenging these ideas that I had. In 1994, I was traveling home from, I had the 3 kids in my car, and we stopped at Pizza Hut, ordered the dinner, and we were waiting outside, and it's Christmas time, so there's Christmas songs on, and Tyler decides to ask all of a sudden about Jesus. And I thought I could talk to him about the kinder, gentler Jesus, and that this was going to be a good thing. So I started talking to him about heaven and all of the benefits that the believer experiences. And he stopped me in my recitation, and he wanted to know about the people who didn't believe. Bless his little atheist heart. So I told him that the Bible says they go to a place called hell. And I didn't have to explain to him what hell was. I thought that was very interesting. And he wanted to know quickly, before I went off on another tangent, he wanted to know how long they had to spend in hell. And I said, well, the Bible says eternity. And he didn't understand that word. He wanted to know what eternity was. So I told him it meant forever. And he started crying. And pretty soon the twins are in their seats in the back crying. And I started crying because I remembered this kid, 8 years old, in the church pew, terrified about eternity and suffering. So not long after that, I stopped taking the kids to church and deliberately started thinking in terms of teaching them to think critically. I don't know where it came from, folks, but I had the foresight to recognize that if I tried to impose the idea that there was no God on them, it would be just as destructive as trying to impose on them the idea that there was. So I avoided that, and I tried to teach them how to think for themselves. And it was a challenge. And then September 11th happened, and I remember watching the people in America trying to deal with this tragedy. We had a neighbor who lost his daughter in the second airplane that went into the tower. And I worked with him for preparing his memorial service, and I watched him frantically looking for an explanation and a justification for this loss. And I remember thinking at the time I had an epiphany when I watched the people dealing with an act of blind faith and the violence that it begat by turning to blind faith. And then in 2004, I picked up a book written by Michael Shermer called The Science of Good and Evil. And that was probably one of the first moments that things started clicking for me, that it was going to be okay if I let go of this idea. Because here was someone who was saying the things that I'd been thinking for years, and the idea that there were people out there who felt the same way I did was remarkable to me. So I came to understand that basically we live in a world of ideas, folks. We define our reality with ideas. We give credibility to ideas by calling them facts, or capital T, truth. But what I didn't realize is that really no idea is of any value until we vetted it, until we tested it, and proven it through experimentation. So I began to challenge the ideas that I had come into my adult life with from my childhood. So I started asking the hard question, what gave the Bible validity as the inspired word of the Creator? And was the evidence sufficient to retain that belief? What proof did I have? Lacking, if I don't any longer subscribe to the Bible being what it says it is, what other evidence is there for ideas like physical violence is necessary for a child to be raised properly? What evidence is there that women are inherently inferior outside of the Bible? And there's none there. I spoke earlier of an epiphany I had following September 11th. And what I came up with, the idea that occurred to me was that it's very possible, very likely, that blind faith is one of the greatest threats that we face today as humans. It's an epistemology thing. A fundamental attribute of faith is that it cannot be challenged. If I invoke faith as justification for a belief, I'm bound to allow that for all others. If I invoke faith for my belief, I now live in a world where it's okay to fly planes into buildings, because that idea was built on faith. The thing that protects the people from dangerous ideas is the ability to challenge them with reason and logic. Faith takes that away. King James talks about faith, hope, and love. These are desirable characteristics. 18-month-old Dean Heelman, playing in his backyard, stepped on a sliver of glass, cut his foot. His parents, motivated by love, treated the wound and comforted the child. But as the bleeding continued, love motivated them to reach out for more help. But faith motivated them to reach out to the pastor for that help. Faith motivated them to choose the biblical words of James that prayer and anointing with oil was the prescribed treatment for their son's injury. Love motivated them to save their son. Faith motivated them to choose an unaccountable method. Little Dean never saw his second birthday because of faith. Ideas, ladies and gentlemen. Let me challenge you with a new idea, a simple one. Faith is not a virtue. It allows evil to flourish unchecked. Running out of time here. I'm sorry, guys. Well, okay, so let me just end with this. There's really some good stuff in here. So the final thought I generally close with is that I kind of use it as a mantra and remind myself of every day when I'm sober enough. The famed British philosopher Bertrand Russell was interviewed late in his life. He was asked, what would you think it's worth telling future generations about the life you've lived and the lessons you've learned from it? And in his reply, he said, I should like to say two things, one intellectual and one moral. The intellectual thing I should want to say is this. When you're studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you wish to believe or what you think would have beneficent social effect if it were believed. But look only and solely at what are the facts. That's the intellectual thing. The moral thing I should wish to say, I should say love is wise and hatred is foolish. Thank you all very much.
running out of time, so we're going to limit the question and answer here to the first 5 questions. And please try and keep them really brief. Just say a question, sit down, and we'll try and get as many as we can. But five's the limit. Okay, thanks, Nate.
There are no child protection laws that could be invoked to help children like you growing up in that sort of family?
You know, it's interesting you would ask that question. When I first gave my talk, the first time I spoke was at the American Atheist Convention in 2009, and Richard Dawkins had spoken just before me, and so he was sitting in the crowd. And after my talk, I look up and I see him rushing to the microphone, and I'm like, oh my God. Did not expect that. So, and that was the essence of his question: how in the world is this man not in prison? And yes, they were there. In fact, in the early 1970s, the police came and took myself and one of my brothers down to the police station, took photos of the damage, and brought charges against my father. But as I mentioned earlier, my father was a litigious person. He was a battler. And it takes a lot of political will to follow through on some of these things, especially when you have someone who just is relentlessly going against you. In addition, the system itself was flawed because first of all, they took the pictures and then they sent us home. And of course, that night we both got beat again because we brought this on the church. But in addition to that, they assigned an attorney to represent us, who only got to interview us once, and this was after being coached by our father, and the interview happened in front of my father in his office. So you try to imagine what is the likelihood we're going to present an adequate case for them to do something in those circumstances. So ultimately it failed, and that was the only time I can recall there being an effort made by the authorities. The political will just wasn't there.
Fantastic talk, thank you. Given recent events, what do you think the future for the Westboro Baptist Church is?
Good question. The future of the Westboro Baptist Church is anybody's guess. I mean, I believe that my father was the primary driving force behind that, and I used to say basically I thought it would die after he did. But they show a remarkable resilience, and they have clearly made plans to deal with his passing. And there are several of them who have exhibited the same kind of intensity and focus as my father, including my youngest brother and my sister Shirley. So I think that at least for now, they will continue on. I also think that because so many of the young ones are leaving, that has the possibility of eventually tipping things. Because Shirley's lost, I think, 4, maybe 5 of her 11 now to the evil world, and several of my other siblings have lost some of theirs as well. So as that exodus continues, I think that may speak to her a lot as well.
Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you for sharing this with us. And secondly, you talked about the journey through your life and challenging all of your deeply held beliefs. Do you think you're still challenging those beliefs?
Yes, I do. I think that we don't even realize how much we have let go of them, so to speak. I catch myself even now responding to something too strongly, being too emotionally connected to it, only to discover because I still hold on to some transient piece of the theology that I grew up with. So I don't think you ever get over it. I think you just learn to manage it more effectively.
Thank you very much. That was immensely powerful, and thank you very much for sharing it. Are you still in touch with any of your siblings or any of your nieces and nephews, any family members?
Well, the ones that are there, we can't have a relationship with. But I have a brother, I talked about Mark, he and I worked together for 25 years in business. And then I have a sister who left as well, who I have a good relationship with. And in developing relationships with a lot of the nieces and nephews as they're leaving that place. So things are going in the right direction as far as that goes. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.